Pamela Anderson spent 30 years being sold to the world as the ultimate tabloid punchline, the Baywatch icon, the Playboy cover girl, one of the most photographed women of the 1990s. But behind the red swimsuit and the tabloid headlines was a woman who spent decades moving from one turbulent relationship to the next, some of them ending in jail sentences, restraining orders, and injuries she carried quietly for years before ever speaking about them publicly. One night in particular changed the entire course of her life, and it happened while she was holding her own newborn son, a night that would eventually become one of the most talked about domestic violence cases in celebrity history. Stick around, because this story goes far deeper than anything the tabloids of the 90s ever told you. The girl from Ladysmith. Before the fame, before the red swimsuit, and before any of the marriages that would define so much of her public life, Pamela Anderson was simply a small-town girl from Ladysmith, British Columbia, a quiet logging community on Vancouver Island. She was born on July 1st, 1967, to a waitress mother and a furnace repairman father, and by her own later accounts, her childhood home was marked by real instability, including her father's struggles with alcohol and a household that moved frequently as her parents' relationship went through repeated periods of separation and reconciliation. It was, from the very beginning, not the picture-perfect upbringing that her later glamorous image might have suggested. Those early years in a small Canadian town gave Anderson a grounded, practical sense of self that friends and colleagues would later describe as surprisingly at odds with her larger-than-life public image. She has spoken warmly in later interviews about the natural beauty of Vancouver Island, describing herself as someone who always felt more at home surrounded by animals and the outdoors than she ever did navigating the glamour of Hollywood, a preference that would eventually draw her back to a quiet rural property in Canada decades later, long after she had become one of the most famous women in the world, choosing to raise her own family in that same rural setting whenever her career allowed for it. Anderson's path to fame began almost by accident. In 1989, while attending a football game in Vancouver, wearing a fitted Labatt's beer shirt, she was spotted by the stadium's camera operators and shown on the Jumbotron, sparking an eruption of applause from the crowd. The moment caught the attention of the beer company itself, and within a short time, Anderson was being featured in print advertisements, a break that eventually led to an invitation to pose for Playboy magazine. Her first Playboy cover appeared in October of 1989, and it launched a modeling and acting career that would soon make her one of the most recognizable faces in the entire world, appearing on the magazine's cover more times over the following decades than almost any other model in its history, a distinction that would remain closely tied to her public identity for the rest of her career. By the early 1990s, Anderson had landed a recurring role on the sitcom Home Improvement, before being cast in the role that would define her career and her public image for the rest of her life, C.J. Parker on the syndicated series Baywatch, which she joined in 1992. The show became a global phenomenon, reportedly reaching over 1 billion viewers across more than 100 countries at its peak, and Anderson herself became one of the most photographed and talked about women on the planet almost overnight. Her image splashed across magazine covers, posters, and television screens in nearly every corner of the globe. Fans and critics alike often reduced her entire public identity down to little more than the red swimsuit she wore on screen, an oversimplified image that Anderson herself has said took her decades to fully step outside of, even as she continued building a career that extended well beyond that single iconic role. But behind that carefully constructed image of sun-soaked glamour, Anderson was carrying private pain that the public would not fully learn about until decades later. A childhood shadowed by abuse. Long before any of her marriages made headlines, Anderson has said publicly that her childhood included experiences of abuse that shaped the way she approached relationships and trust for the rest of her life. In her own memoir and a later Netflix documentary, she described being sexually abused for several years as a young child by a female babysitter entrusted with her care, an experience she said left her confused and frightened, and one she felt unable to tell anyone about at the time, in part because she worried the person responsible for hurting her had also threatened her into silence. She has said that as a young child, she didn't fully understand what was happening to her, and that it took her many years into adulthood before she could even begin to name the experience for what it truly was. She has also spoken about being sexually assaulted by an older boy during her early teenage years, and about an early relationship in her teens with a boyfriend who behaved in frightening and controlling ways toward her, including incidents where he tried to run her off the road with his car. Anderson has spoken candidly about how these early experiences shaped her instincts and choices later in life, describing a pattern where she found herself repeatedly drawn to complicated, difficult men, something she has reflected on with remarkable openness in more recent years. She has noted that for much of her adult life, she avoided fully processing these earliest experiences, choosing instead to keep moving forward, staying busy with work and new relationships, rather than confronting the lasting impact those years had left on her. It was only decades later, through therapy and the process of writing her own memoir, that she began to more fully understand just how deeply those early experiences had shaped so many of the choices that followed. It's an important piece of context for understanding everything that followed, because by the time she became one of the most famous women in the world, Anderson had already survived experiences that most people never have to speak about publicly at all, let alone under the intense scrutiny of worldwide fame. That pattern would soon repeat itself in her adult life, beginning with a whirlwind romance so fast that even Anderson herself later admitted she barely knew her new husband's full name before marrying him. 4 days in Mexico. On New Year's Eve in 1994, Anderson met Motley Crue drummer Tommy Lee at a Hollywood club, and their connection was immediate and intense. She later recalled the moment vividly, describing how Lee approached her with an almost startling boldness the very first time they crossed paths, an encounter she found simultaneously alarming and magnetic. Lee pursued her aggressively in the weeks that followed, and when Anderson traveled to Mexico for a photo shoot shortly afterward, he followed her there, showing up unannounced, determined to see her again, despite the distance. What happened next became one of the most talked about whirlwind romances of the entire decade. Just 96 hours after reconnecting in Mexico, the two were married on a beach, with matching tattoos of each other's names inked onto their ring fingers in place of traditional wedding bands, a decision that captured just how impulsively the entire relationship had unfolded from its very first moments. Anderson has since acknowledged that she barely knew basic details about Lee's life at the time of their wedding, a fact she has reflected on with a mixture of humor and genuine reflection in later interviews, describing the marriage as something that felt less like a calculated decision and more like being swept up in a current she couldn't fully control. The early years of their marriage played out largely in the public eye, filled with genuine passion, but also mounting tension as the couple welcomed two sons together, Brandon Thomas Lee in 1996 and Dylan Jagger Lee in 1997. Their relationship was further complicated in 1995 when a private videotape of the couple was stolen from their home and eventually leaked and distributed without their consent, an intensely violating experience that Anderson has since described as one of the most traumatic events of her entire life, one that followed her for decades and shaped public perception of her in ways she never wanted or consented to. The tape's unauthorized release turned an intensely private moment between two newlyweds into a source of public fascination and mockery that Anderson has said contributed to a lasting sense of vulnerability and lack of control over her own image for years afterward. A violation she has since compared to a form of assault carried out not by a person, but by an entire media and legal system that seemed largely indifferent to the harm it caused her at the time. She has said in later interviews that she still, to this day, has never watched the tape in full, describing the entire ordeal as something she was forced to survive rather than something she ever willingly participated in sharing with the public. Behind closed doors, tension within the marriage had been building for some time, driven in part by Lee's own struggles with jealousy and insecurity following the birth of their children, feelings he later admitted to in his own writing, describing himself during this period as consumed by a need for attention that he struggled to manage in healthy ways. He wrote candidly in his own memoir about feeling increasingly sidelined as Anderson's focus shifted toward their newborn sons, admitting that his own immaturity and insecurity made it difficult for him to adjust to the demands of new fatherhood in a constructive way. By early 1998, those tensions were about to boil over into an incident that would change the entire trajectory of both of their lives, and one that would finally force the public to see past the glamorous image of their marriage entirely. The night everything changed. On February 24th, 1998, an argument broke out between Anderson and Lee at their Malibu home, reportedly beginning over a dispute involving Anderson's parents visiting. According to accounts later given by both Anderson and Lee himself, the confrontation escalated into physical violence, with Lee kicking Anderson while she held their 7-week-old son, Dylan, in her arms. Anderson was left with visible injuries, including bruising and a torn fingernail, and she called the police, who arrived and arrested Lee at the scene. By his own account, written years later in his own memoir, Lee described the argument spiraling out of control after Anderson struck him first, at which point he grabbed her, and as she attempted to get away from him, he kicked her, and a struggle over their crying son followed that ultimately left Anderson on the ground. Lee was initially charged with felony spousal abuse, child abuse, and unlawful possession of a firearm. In April of 1998, he pled no contest to the felony spousal abuse charge, an outcome with the same legal weight as a guilty plea, and the remaining charges were dropped as part of the agreement. The following month, a judge sentenced him to 6 months in county jail, along with a 3-year probation period that required him to attend anger management counseling, complete 200 hours of community service, contribute financially to a domestic violence support fund, and submit to random drug and alcohol testing. The judge overseeing the case reportedly noted that Lee had a lengthy prior record of violent incidents dating back over a decade, and warned that any violation of his probation terms would result in a full 3-year prison sentence, a stern warning that underscored just how seriously the court treated the pattern of behavior underlying this particular case. Lee ultimately served 4 months of that sentence before his early release, a detail that itself drew criticism from advocates who felt the punishment did not fully reflect the severity of what had happened. Anderson filed for divorce in the days immediately following the incident, bringing an end to a marriage that had captivated the public for 3 years. Speaking outside the courthouse after Lee's sentencing, Anderson expressed a complicated mix of emotions, telling reporters she was proud of him for taking responsibility and hopeful that the experience might mark a genuine turning point. Comments that reflected just how difficult and layered her feelings toward Lee remained, even in the immediate aftermath of the assault. Years later, during a subsequent custody dispute, Anderson described the incident in far more direct terms, recalling that Lee had kicked her repeatedly and violently while she feared for both her own safety and that of their children, a stark contrast to the more measured, forgiving language she had used publicly at the time of his sentencing. It remains, even decades later, one of the most widely documented cases of domestic violence, involving a major celebrity couple in American entertainment history, a case that helped shape public conversations about intimate partner violence for years afterward, occurring at a time when mainstream media coverage of domestic abuse rarely treated the subject with the seriousness or nuance it deserved, often reducing what had happened to little more than a scandalous tabloid headline rather than a genuine criminal matter with lasting consequences for everyone involved. A complicated, lingering bond. Despite the severity of what had happened, Anderson and Lee's relationship did not simply end after the divorce. The two remained connected for years afterward, largely due to their shared responsibility raising their two sons, and they occasionally reconciled romantically during the years that followed, drawing public confusion and concern given everything that had happened between them. Friends of the couple later described the dynamic as genuinely difficult to understand from the outside, a bond that seemed to combine real affection and shared history with the lasting weight of what had happened between them. Something Anderson herself has acknowledged as complicated and, at times, difficult to fully explain even to herself, let alone to a public that had watched the worst night of her marriage play out in courtrooms and headlines. In 2000, while the two were spending time together during a holiday celebration, Anderson reportedly witnessed Lee drinking alcohol, a clear violation of the terms of his ongoing probation, which resulted in his return to jail for an additional 5 days. It was a small but telling reminder of just how entangled their lives remained, even years after their divorce, with Anderson herself inadvertently becoming a witness in the very legal process that had once been designed to hold Lee accountable for his actions toward her. Their complicated bond continued well into the following decades, occasionally surfacing in public disputes that echoed the tension of their original marriage. In 2018, a physical altercation broke out between Lee and his adult son, Brandon, reportedly sparked by comments Lee had posted online about Anderson. Lee later claimed publicly that his son had struck him unprovoked, while other accounts suggested the confrontation stemmed from years of accumulated tension surrounding how Lee had spoken about Anderson over the years. Following that incident, Anderson issued a public statement expressing concern for her ex-husband's well-being, describing him as someone who appeared to be struggling with alcohol dependency, a comment that spoke to just how enduring and complicated their connection remained, even decades after the marriage itself had ended. It's worth noting that around this same period, in the aftermath of her divorce from Lee, Anderson experienced another deeply frightening incident at her own home, when a young woman was discovered squatting inside her Malibu residence, and the encounter ended with the intruder harming herself in front of responding police officers. It was a jarring reminder of just how exposed and vulnerable fame had made her, even within the walls of her own home. And Anderson has since spoken about how unsettling it was to realize that even her most private, personal space no longer felt entirely safe or her own. But while the chapter with Tommy Lee had closed, at least on paper, Anderson's search for a lasting, healthy partnership was far from over, and the next relationship on this list would prove to be one of the most impulsive and short-lived of her entire life. A brief, combustible marriage to Kid Rock. In the mid-2000s, Anderson began a relationship with musician Kid Rock, whose real name is Robert James Ritchie. The two dated on and off for several years before finally marrying in the summer of 2006, holding 4 separate wedding ceremonies to mark the occasion, including one aboard a yacht off the coast of Saint-Tropez, France. A lavish, celebratory beginning that stood in sharp contrast to how quickly the marriage would ultimately unravel, and one that reflected just how much both of them seemed genuinely invested in celebrating the relationship publicly at the time. For a while, the relationship appeared to represent a genuinely lighter, more playful chapter of Anderson's romantic life, with the two frequently photographed together, looking relaxed and affectionate at public events throughout their courtship. though it too proved to be remarkably short-lived. According to Anderson's own later accounts, the marriage began unraveling around the release of the film Borat in late 2006, when Kid Rock's visible discomfort and jealousy at the film's premiere marked what she described as the beginning of the end. In her own memoir, Anderson recalled that Kid Rock harbored a persistent skepticism towards some of the people in her professional orbit, including photographer David LaChapelle, and that tensions surrounding her career and the attention she continued to receive publicly created friction that neither of them ultimately found a way to resolve. The couple separated only months after their wedding, and Anderson filed for divorce that November, citing irreconcilable differences, bringing their marriage to a close after less than a year together. Unlike her marriage to Lee, there's no public record of physical violence connected to this relationship, though Anderson has since described it, along with several of her other marriages, as part of a broader pattern of relationships that moved too quickly and ended in disappointment rather than the lasting partnership she kept hoping to find. She has reflected candidly in later interviews that she often found herself swept up in the excitement and intensity of a new relationship before she had truly had the chance to determine whether the person in front of her was actually a good match for the kind of stable, lasting partnership she genuinely wanted. That search for lasting partnership would soon lead her toward a man she would end up marrying not once, but twice, in a relationship that would eventually become one of the most turbulent and legally contentious chapters of her entire personal history. Twice. Married to the same man. In October of 2007, Anderson married professional poker player Rick Salomon in a ceremony in Las Vegas, following years of friendship between the two. The marriage, however, lasted only a matter of months. According to Anderson's own later account, the relationship fell apart that December when her assistant discovered what appeared to be a drug paraphernalia item hidden inside their Christmas tree, an object Salomon denied belonged to him, insisting instead that someone else must have planted it there. Anderson has since said she felt she couldn't take the risk of remaining in the marriage given the discovery, and the two had their marriage formally annulled just months after their wedding, with Anderson later recalling the entire episode with a mixture of disbelief and dark humor when discussing it publicly years afterward. Remarkably, the two eventually reconciled years later, and in January of 2014, Anderson and Salomon married for a second time, a decision that surprised many close to Anderson, given everything that had led to the end of their first marriage, and one she has since reflected on as evidence of just how difficult it could be to fully walk away from a familiar, if troubled, relationship. This second marriage proved to be even more turbulent than the first, and it ultimately ended in one of the more explosive and legally documented breakups of Anderson's entire life. In March and April of 2015, Anderson filed for and was granted restraining orders against Salomon, describing in her legal filings a genuine fear of what he might be capable of doing to her. Language that echoed, in its own way, the kind of language she had used decades earlier when describing her fear during her marriage to Tommy Lee. The court documents she submitted included disturbing written messages allegedly sent by Salomon, in which he made cruel and deeply personal accusations against her, including false and hurtful claims about her reproductive history that she has since described as devastating to read. Among the messages included in her filings were accusations referring to her in deeply dehumanizing terms, and claims suggesting she had a hidden history of ending pregnancies during her prior relationships. Allegations Anderson has firmly denied, and which she described as among the most painful things anyone had ever said to her during any of her relationships, particularly given how deeply personal and unverifiable the claims were. Salomon, for his part, has continued to dispute several of Anderson's characterizations of their relationship in the years since. maintaining his own account of events, even as Anderson has continued to speak publicly about the fear she experienced during the final months of their marriage. Their divorce was finalized by the end of April 2015, closing out a relationship that Anderson has since described as one of the most painful and psychologically difficult of her entire life, even though it never involved the kind of documented physical violence that had defined her marriage to Tommy Lee. Between these two deeply painful chapters, involving two different husbands years apart, a clear and troubling pattern had emerged in Anderson's romantic history, one that she herself would eventually come to recognize and speak about candidly in the years that followed. But her next marriage would offer a strange and sudden contrast, one so brief that it barely had time to make headlines before it was already over. The shortest marriage of her life. In January of 2020, Anderson married legendary Hollywood producer John Peters, a man she had actually known since first arriving in the United States decades earlier, long before either of them had achieved the level of fame they would eventually reach. Their history together stretched back more than 3 decades, to the earliest days of Anderson's career, and the two had reportedly stayed in touch periodically over the years, even as both of their lives took vastly different paths, with Peters going on to produce major Hollywood films, while Anderson built her own career as a model and actress, their paths crossing occasionally at industry events over the decades that followed. The two had remained close over the years, and their sudden decision to marry in a private ceremony in Malibu surprised many who followed Anderson's personal life closely. The wedding was attended by both of their children from previous relationships, suggesting, at least outwardly, a genuine sense of family investment in the union. That marriage, however, turned out to be the shortest of Anderson's entire life. Just 12 days after their wedding ceremony, the couple announced they were parting ways, with Anderson releasing a gentle, almost poetic statement describing their decision to take time apart to reevaluate what they truly wanted from life and from each other. The statement stood out for its warmth and lack of bitterness, describing love as an ongoing process rather than a fixed destination, language that felt notably different from the tone surrounding the endings of several of her previous marriages, and one that many entertainment reporters at the time noted as unusually graceful, given the sheer speed and public nature of the split. Unlike several of her previous marriages, this particular split appears to have remained remarkably amicable, with both Anderson and Peters continuing to speak warmly and affectionately about one another in interviews conducted in the years that followed. Peters later revealed that he intended to leave Anderson a substantial inheritance in his will, a gesture that spoke to the genuine depth of affection that persisted between them long after their brief marriage had ended. It stood as one of the more gentle endings on this list, even if its sheer brevity made it one of the most talked about celebrity marriages of the entire year, generating headlines less for any conflict between the couple and more for the sheer speed with which the entire relationship had begun and ended. Just months later, however, Anderson would find herself walking down the aisle one final time, in a marriage that seemed, at least initially, to offer the quiet, grounded stability that had eluded her for so many years before. A quiet marriage that ultimately faded. In the fall of 2020, during the isolation of the early COVID-19 pandemic, Anderson grew close to a local construction worker and part-time bodyguard named Dan Hayhurst, whom she had met through their shared involvement with an animal sanctuary near her home in Canada. The two bonded over their mutual love of animals, spending long stretches of time together at the sanctuary during a period when much of the world remained in strict lockdown, a shared purpose that gave their early relationship a sense of genuine, grounded connection, rather than the fast-paced glamour that had characterized several of her previous romances, and one that felt, at least in its earliest months, like a refreshing departure from the pattern that had defined so much of her adult romantic life up to that point. After only a matter of months, they married in a small ceremony on Christmas Eve of 2020, a marriage that represented a striking departure from the fame and spectacle of her previous unions, given Hayhurst's complete distance from the entertainment industry. For a while, the relationship appeared to offer Anderson exactly the kind of grounded, low-key partnership she had spent so many years searching for amid the chaos of her more public relationships. She spoke in interviews conducted shortly after their wedding about feeling a sense of peace and normalcy with Hayhurst that had often felt out of reach in her previous, more publicly scrutinized marriages, describing their shared rural lifestyle as a genuine relief after so many years spent in the spotlight. But the marriage ultimately could not withstand the pressures of such a rapid beginning, and the couple separated after roughly a year together, with Anderson filing for divorce in early 2022. Sources close to Anderson at the time suggested that the prolonged closeness of pandemic isolation had allowed underlying incompatibilities to surface that might not have emerged as quickly under more ordinary circumstances, with one source telling entertainment outlets that Anderson had come to understand aspects of Hayhurst's character during their time together that ultimately did not align with what she had originally believed about him. The divorce was finalized without any of the public acrimony that had characterized several of her earlier marriages, marking it as one of the more low-conflict endings among her 5 marriages, even if the underlying disappointment of yet another relationship failing to last clearly weighed on her. By the time this final marriage came to an end, Anderson had been married 5 separate times to 4 different men across nearly 3 decades, a personal history marked by genuine highs alongside some of the most painful and well-documented low points of any major celebrity's romantic life during this era. But rather than continuing to let these experiences remain private tabloid fodder, Anderson would soon make a deliberate and remarkably candid choice to reclaim her own story entirely, on her own terms, for the very first time. Reclaiming her own story. In the years following her final divorce, Anderson made the decision to speak more openly than ever before about the difficult chapters of her personal history. In January of 2023, she released both a candid memoir titled Love, Pamela, and a companion Netflix documentary called Pamela, A Love Story, both of which offered her own detailed and often deeply vulnerable account of her marriages, her childhood experiences, and the toll that decades of public scrutiny had taken on her sense of self. Both projects arrived roughly a year after a separate, dramatized television series about her marriage to Tommy Lee was released without her involvement or consent, a project Anderson and her family reportedly viewed as an exploitative retelling of some of the most painful moments of her life, and one that appears to have directly motivated her decision to finally tell her own version of events, in her own words, for the first time. Anderson reportedly declined to watch the dramatized series in full, and those close to her described her reaction to its release as one of genuine hurt, given how deeply personal and painful the events being reenacted for entertainment actually were for her and her family, especially her 2 sons, who had grown up largely shielded from the more sensational aspects of their parents' history. In these projects, she spoke directly and without euphemism about the domestic violence she experienced during her marriage to Tommy Lee, the psychological toll of her relationship with Rick Salomon, and the childhood abuse that had shaped so much of her adult life, long before any of her husbands ever entered the picture. She has been careful, however, to resist a purely victim-centered narrative, frequently emphasizing in interviews that she does not see herself as someone defined by what happened to her, but rather as someone who has continued to make her own choices and find genuine joy despite everything she has experienced. It's worth noting that even beyond her marriages, Anderson has spoken publicly about facing troubling allegations of abuse within at least one significant relationship that never reached marriage at all. a 2-year relationship with French footballer Adil Rami that ended in 2019 amid public accusations of both infidelity and mistreatment. Claims that Rami firmly denied at the time, publishing his own lengthy public statement, rejecting her characterization of their relationship entirely, and describing himself as someone deeply committed to causes related to preventing violence against women, making the public dispute between them especially contentious and widely covered in both American and French media at the time. Taken together, these accounts paint a picture of a woman who spent decades navigating an entertainment industry and a series of personal relationships that repeatedly tested her safety and her sense of self. Long before the broader cultural conversation around domestic violence and public accountability had caught up to what she had already been living through in private. In the years since sharing her story so openly, Anderson has continued reinventing her public image in ways that have surprised many longtime observers of her career, including a celebrated return to Broadway theatre, a widely praised cosmetics-free red carpet presence that challenged decades of beauty industry expectations, and a leading film role in 2025's The Last Showgirl that earned her some of the strongest critical reviews of her entire career, with several critics specifically praising the raw vulnerability she brought to a role that echoed, in certain ways, her own decades-long relationship with fame, aging, and public perception. A performance many described as a genuine reintroduction of Anderson as a serious dramatic actress after decades spent largely defined by her earlier, more glamorous public image. She has continued to speak candidly about her past relationships without framing herself as simply a victim, instead, describing her journey as one of survival, resilience, and an ongoing process of genuinely getting to know herself outside the context of any partner at all. A story still being written. Looking back across all 5 of Pamela Anderson's marriages, what emerges is a story far more complicated and painful than the glamorous tabloid image that once defined her public persona throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. Her marriage to Tommy Lee remains the most widely documented case of domestic violence within her personal history, a criminal case with real legal consequences that played out under intense public scrutiny, at a time when conversations about domestic abuse rarely received the seriousness they deserved in mainstream media coverage. Her relationship with Rick Salomon, spanning 2 separate marriages years apart, revealed a different but no less painful pattern of psychological harm and fear, one that ultimately required legal intervention to bring to a close. Between those 2 deeply difficult chapters sat other marriages that, while often short-lived and impulsive, didn't carry the same documented history of abuse, evidence that Anderson's story was never simply one continuous narrative of victimization, but rather a genuinely complicated life filled with both real joy and real pain, sometimes within the very same relationship. Her brief marriage to Kid Rock, her 12-day union with John Peters, and her pandemic-era marriage to Dan Hayhurst each reflected different facets of a woman still searching, well into her 50s, for the kind of lasting partnership that had eluded her since she was a young woman first navigating fame and adulthood at the same overwhelming time. What ultimately sets her story apart, decades later, isn't just the difficulty of what she experienced, but her eventual decision to speak about all of it so openly and on her own terms, refusing to let any single chapter, however painful, define the entirety of who she is. That decision arrived only after decades of watching other people, tabloids, filmmakers, and former partners, tell versions of her own story without her input or consent, making her eventual choice to reclaim that narrative feel like an especially hard-won and meaningful act of self-determination, arriving only after she had lived through nearly every chapter of it in full public view, often with far less control over how her own experiences were portrayed than most people could ever imagine having to endure. Decades after she first became famous, Pamela Anderson's story continues to resonate with audiences, not simply because of the fame or the scandal that once surrounded her name, but because of the honesty she eventually found the courage to share, transforming a life once reduced to tabloid punchlines into a genuinely compelling story about survival, self discovery, and the long, difficult process of reclaiming a narrative that had, for far too long, been written by everyone except her. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.